Hello, people of the internet, my name is Atlas, and I wanted to see if I could get one more video out before Deltarune releases. And it only feels right for that video to be tackling one of the biggest mysteries of the game, the Knight. Since Chapter 2, the community has suggested a wide variety of candidates, each with their own ups and downs, and I thought it would be nice to take one last look at some of the most popular choices and give my thoughts on them. At first, this video is going to be more focused on the thematic and narrative aspects of each character, and I still will be talking about that. However, I realize that with where we are in the game, most candidates have the potential to fit into these categories. So instead, I'm going to be talking about each of these as a whole, and see where that takes us. So let's start out with who everyone thought was the Knight immediately upon finishing Chapter 2. Kris. Kris Knight is an interesting case, and undeniably one of the most controversial candidates, with opinions ranging from it being the most obviously correct choice to being completely impossible. Now, this is a discussion that has been covered multiple times and in more depth than I will be talking about it here, but I do still want to give my own take and thoughts on Kris as a candidate. So starting out with the good, Kris Knight does provide an explanation for why the TV was plugged in between chapters 1 and 2. There are alternate explanations, yes, but the idea that Kris played it in advance to make the Chapter 3 Dark World does seem like the one the game is pushing us in the most. Toby also made a comment comparing Kris to a character from Live Alive, which, without going into spoilers, is definitely another point in favor of Kris Knight, and they, of course, connect strongly with the game's themes and narrative. However, that brings me to my first issue with Kris Knight. The thing is, most of the things that Kris Knight has to offer are not Kris Knight exclusive. Kris is deeply connected to the game's themes because they are the protagonist, and while Toby does seem to be referring to Kris in a way that implies they are a main antagonist to us as the player, this is true regardless of if they are the Knight or not, as they have fairly clearly presented themselves as an opponent to us even since Chapter 1. When it comes to logistics, the main point brought up is whether or not they could have created the Chapter 2 fountain, with Kris Snyders typically arguing that they made it during the night, and Kris deniers saying that it was made during the day, likely while Noelle and Birdley were studying. The specific part of things has been talked ad nauseum, so I won't go too far into it here, but I will bring up one point that I rarely see discussed regarding it. That being that Noelle and Birdley believe that they fell asleep while studying, which only really makes sense if they were already studying before the fountain was opened. Does this completely debunk Kris Knight? No. It is small enough that it could be argued as an oversight, however it is one reason why I'm not quite sold on it myself. There's also the question of motive, which is typically suggested to be attempting to find deaths, and Kris is not the only candidate with this proposed goal. However, to me, this is never quite connected as much as it does with others. As from what we know about Dark Worlds, finding deaths this way seems fairly illogical, as presumably they would have to go to the same Dark World she got lost in to find her. With that, let's move on and talk about yet another highly debated Knight candidate, Alvin. Alright, so starting out with the positives here, Alvin does have some connections to the theme of fiction in the game, being the son of Gerson, a famous writer who seems particularly relevant to the game's overall message. He is also a priest, which is relevant given how much religious imagery Deltarune deals with, and, according to some, could provide a motive, being a desire to summon the angel for religious purposes. Fandom also relates the Knight to communion, which could refer to a religious communion. Gerson himself was also a Knight at some point, so if Alvin wishes to be more like his father, perhaps that would explain why he chose such a title. He also has more reason than most to go into the unused classroom without questioning. There's also this weird line in Chapter 2 about the hammer buried under Gerson's grave. And we can't forget about the Chapter 4 Dark World, which almost certainly takes place in the church, and could very well feature a Dark World created while we were already inside the initial Dark World, which would make sense if the Knight was in the building. Each Dark World so far has had something Gerson related in it, or at least near it, be it the portrait drawn by Alvin in Chapter 1, the Lord of the Hammer in Chapter 2, or the history of humans and monsters in Chapter 3, even if the Lord of the Hammer was outside of the Dark World, not in it. Of course, the inclusion of Chapter 3 is interesting because we know, of course, that Alvin did not create the fountain, which I think brings me to some of my issues with this theory, being that the Gerson stuff doesn't really feel like concrete evidence in his favor. To me, I think the stuff being built up with Gerson is just that, stuff being built up with Gerson specifically, especially considering how he appears to be a counterpart to Gaster at this point. Gerson was a writer, not Alvin. Gerson is brought up repeatedly throughout the game, not Alvin. Gerson was a Knight in Undertale, not Alvin. You get the point. Furthermore, while I'm certainly not saying Alvin is unimportant to the game, the exact level of importance he has to the main story is questionable, given he lacks both a talk sprite and voice blips, and has no kind of face covering that would justify giving him them later on, through a reveal like Undyne or Metaton in Undertale. He isn't mentioned in the Goner Maker if you choose his name, and the way his sprites are made are kind of strange if Toby is intending him to do a lot of moving, as the way his angle would likely result in it looking somewhat off. though this could be helped some via a Dark World sprite. This preemptive dialogue is also a bit shaky, as in the Japanese version of the game, the religious meaning is entirely lost, simply referring to a general point of contact. The dialogue about the hammer is certainly interesting, definitely worth taking a look at, but it does directly connect him to the knight in a very clear way. I've seen some say it could be what he's using to make fountains, however, the ground over Gerson's grave appears undisturbed, and I don't think Queen would describe the knight's implement as a blade if it was a hammer, even if it did have a spike or something. Another Alvin Knight reading of this line is that he plans to bring it to a Dark World to resurrect Gerson, which I do think works better, especially given what we know about Chapter 4, but it is still essentially speculation, without much proof that puts it above other explanations. Also, I think that Chapter 4 feels a bit early for a knight reveal, especially if the character is only introduced in that same chapter. So, when it comes to Alvin, I do think there's more going on with him for sure, though we could see more in the Chapter 4 Dark World. I just don't know if that includes being the knight. Now, let's talk about Papyrus Knight. I suspect this will be the shortest section of the video. Papyrus Knight largely stems from his absence in Deltarune so far, with the proposed reason for said absence being that he's too busy doing knight stuff. He's also manipulated by Flowing Undertale, which could connect to the themes of control in Deltarune, if something similar is going on here, presumably with Gaster. And he did have aspirations of being a knight. He also makes this funny comment in one of the newsletters about being a villain. However, that is largely where Knight Papyrus evidence ends. Papyrus doesn't really have much of a connection to the rest of the themes of the game, or any connection to the main cast. There's also the question of how he would create the Chapter 1 fountain given it's a public school, and while this doesn't disprove the theory, as we could always just say it's some Gaster or Sand shenanigans going on allowing him to teleport in, it is still strange. I'm also not sure what his motives would be here. I've seen some people suggest it's to make friends in the form of Darkners, however the Knight hasn't stuck around in any of the Dark Worlds, and he doesn't have any reason to put King in power and imprison the others as far as I know. I suppose, for the fountains, he could just think that he's saving the world or something, but that feels pretty weak, especially since we could presumably just tell him the truth to get him to stop in that case. Now we're about to go into my top 3 candidates, and to be clear, the 3 before were not ordered in terms of belief. Before getting into that though, I want to give some honorable mentions. Asgore Knight, there's definitely some weird connections between him and the Dark World, and he does have a relevant place in the narrative, but personally I think that will come into fruition in the Flower King Dark World instead. Still though, probably the best UT Knight candidate in my opinion, even over Papyrus, who mainly got a larger mention due to popularity. Pizza Pants. It would be very funny. Gaster. I like that he actually has quite a bit of evidence, but we all unanimously agree that he will have a different role in the story. Rudy. I'm going to be honest, I just wanted to show off this Rudy Knight sprite, but I guess he has foreshadowed every Dark World so far. Too bad he's sick and bedridden. Alright, on to the final 3. Starting with Nightmare, a pun that put her up a whole tier in my theory ranking when I first found it. Also, as far as I know, I'm the first to point it out, so that's neat. I think the fact that a motif from the song Toby made for another project called Nightmare Knight has appeared in Deltarune in places related to darkness also lends this pun a bit more weight as well. The mayor likely has free reign to go wherever, given she's the mayor, and has some obvious connection to 2 of our main characters. She also has a pretty strong connection to the theme of control, given her position of leadership, and the control she exerts over Noelle. Speaking of, out of all the Lightner characters, she is the one put in the most antagonistic light, and has been established as being quite physically powerful as well, which definitely makes sense if she is one of our main antagonists. However, I think where Nightmare struggles is in regards to the themes of fiction and escapism. While I believe the mayor does make use of escapism herself, this mostly appears to be in the form of her work, and she doesn't really fit the idea of creating escapism all that much either. The only real thing I can think of in that regard would be her preparations for the fair, which are something, but not quite as strong as they could be, as it feels far less personal. There's also the question of her motive, once again often suggested to be an attempt to fight deaths, but as I've already explained, that doesn't work super well to me. This could be a double layer of control thing where she's doing this for something like Gaster in exchange for deaths, but that is largely speculation, and I do have to question if she would open a fountain with Noelle in it, especially given this is the same person who took Noelle's games from her because she was crying, and canceled school because she was scared of rain. This leads us to our next potential knight, another holiday, Death's Holiday. Even among these popular candidates, I'd say Death sticks out as one of, if not the most popular, and it's for good reason. The mystery of Death has been well established in the story so far, and she very obviously has some pretty big connections to Kris and Noelle, more so than any other candidate I've mentioned aside from, well, Kris. Furthermore, Noelle makes some interesting comments that could make for some great ironic foreshadowing if she is the knight. Particularly, Noelle's mentioned that Death said she would take her somewhere like this, which, if she is the knight, she would have fulfilled. We have also received a few mentions of some playful spats between her and Kris when they were kids, which would be quite impactful if they ended up in a much more serious conflict during the game. She does seem related to Gaster stuff as well, which does give her some points from the mention of the knight standing in front of the great door in Toby's description of the Unused intro. I think Death starts to struggle a bit though when looking at the themes of the game, though this could just come from the fact that we don't actually know a ton about Death. We don't have much to connect her to the themes of fiction, escapism, or control, other than the fact that the mayor may have been controlling towards her the way that she is with Noelle, but even then, some of that behavior could have stemmed from Death's disappearance. There's also the question of how she would actually make these fountains, as she can't even walk anywhere publicly given she's missing. Maybe due to the caster stuff she can teleport, or she's somehow making it from the depths, but that is largely speculation. Whether or not Death would create a dark world with Noelle in it is a bit less clear than with the mayor. As mentioned before, Death did say she'd bring her to a place like this, so maybe that's why she would allow it. She also used to help Noelle feel stronger, which she achieves through the dark world, though it is still worth noting that she was quite protective of Noelle. There's also this dialogue from Spampton, assumed to be from the person in the code, assumed to be Death, which seemingly implies that the speaker is still currently lost, which would make a lot of sense if they were the knight. Though perhaps you could argue that this doesn't have to be from the present, as I doubt Death has been saying this type of thing for years on end without pause. Overall, Death is a character heavily connected with the dark, Gaster, the biggest mysteries of the game, two of our main characters, and will likely be an endgame introduction. And for those reasons alone, not even mentioning some of the more specific things that I did here, I would not be surprised if she did somehow end up being the knight. This brings us to our final candidate and my personal favorite, Vessel Knight. While it has exponentially increased in popularity in recent times, largely thanks to Oblivion Theory by Alex Wendy Doodles on Twitter, which I highly recommend you check out, in the beginning, not many people talked about the Vessel, at least not in the context of the Knight. However, I am proud to say that I have been a Vessel Knight head since the very beginning, or at least since Chapter 2, I guess. So, what makes the Vessel Knight a good candidate? Well, there's quite a lot. For one, the Vessel single-handedly has the easiest when it comes to opportunity, as they are a goner, and we know for a fact that goners can teleport, making it possible for them to create a fountain, anytime, anywhere, without being caught. Even in the case of Chapter 2's, they could create it behind Birdley and Noelle, and instantly teleport away. On a related note, it's clearly connected with Gaster. I mean, he's the one who helped us make it, which connects them to the Great Door and general mysteries of the game nicely. Both the Vessel and the Knight use the pronoun it as well, providing yet another connection that no other Knight candidate really has. It also pretty much embodies the game's theme about control and choice, being made to be controlled, and being the prime example of our choices not mattering. It even connects with fiction and escapism, as it was going to be the vessel through which we experienced it. This is also further suggested via its connection to the Neo body, both of which are described as work-at-ready bodies, and are literal vessels to be controlled, and shaped by the one controlling them. The Neo body is the embodiment of Metatron's dream, just as the vessel is the embodiment of ours. The vessel also connects to Undertale's main antagonist, Flowey, through similar means, with Flowey literally being called a vessel in the True Lab entry. I'd be remiss not to mention the vessel's connection to the Thrash Machine as well, with the entire scene of its creation and subsequent discardment mimicking the creation of the vessel, only for it to come back and be used against us later on, before which it is literally covered by a grayscale ship. A grayscale vessel, if you will. The Spampton dialogue about the Knight is also relevant here, as communion and contact do fit what happens when we create the vessel, with the window title literally changing to contact as we do. And while the vessel doesn't have any relationship to our main characters so far, there is an inherent emotional connection to Kris given its involvement in the events that led to our control over them. As far as motives go, this is maybe the weakest area for the vessel. It is a vessel. Whether it has true motives of its own may seem a bit questionable, though it is notable that we did shape its mind as our own, so the argument could be made that our desire to play the game is what drives it to essentially create it. After all, the game was initially presented to us as a survey to help us create the future. Furthermore, it is likely it is being controlled, be it literally or in a less direct manner. After all, it was made for that purpose, and Gaster does seem to want the prophecy fulfilled, which the Knight is needed for. Of course, some of you may point out that the vessel seems to have been intended to be our player character, so how could they beat the Knight? Well, one option is simply that we were being misled, and that this was never the intention in the first place. However, I think there is another option that makes sense even if that was the plan. Specifically, what if Kris was supposed to be the Knight? However, when we were thrown into their soul, the vessel was used to take their place. This isn't entirely unfounded either. It would explain why they put it in the TV in Chapter 2, and in the concept art for the legend, Susie and Rousey are labeled with their names, but the human is simply labeled The Human, a title that could really only fit the vessel if it is not Kris. There is a bit of a question regarding whether the vessel could create a fountain, given whether or not they have a soul is questionable. However, I'd like to point out that if we were meant to control it, the soul in the intro is likely not Kris's, be it ours or someone else's that could be used for it, especially since it's what we're selecting the choices with, signifying what they belong to. Also, we have had soulless beings with determination before, like Flowey, so I don't think that completely rules out this possibility. And I think that's all I have to say. What do you think? Am I right? Is the vessel the knight? What about the others? Someone I didn't mention? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe. I didn't make this video to put any knight candidates down, simply to give my own thoughts and provide a bit of insight into the subject, so hopefully I didn't upset you. I think it's important that we have different opinions in this fandom, and it allows for a more meaningful discussion, and for ideas to grow and be expanded upon. And I think it's important to remember that going into the new chapters. It's possible that this video will be completely outdated by the time it arrives, but who knows. I plan on uploading my blind playthrough of the chapters here when they come out, so I guess we'll see together. With all that being said, drink water, remember to floss, and don't forget, the impossible is possible. All you gotta do is make it so. Good night.